Data centers together and all of the critical raw materials that go into that are also very important. And I think, we talk about this green transition. We seriously need to look at how this is going to stack up, particularly in Europe, for example. I mean, I guess Europe always seems to be at the forefront of trying to do things from a sustainable perspective. When you start crunching the numbers, how you're going to meet those green transition targets, you suddenly realize that do we have the actual material resource to do this? And data centers are part of that because they're the huge demand on material resources. So at a high level, from a sustainability perspective, that could be a mistake to focus entirely on carbon. This is Jon Summers from Research Institutes of Sweden out of the ICE Data Center Unit. You are watching the Data Center Go-to-Market podcast.
Welcome, data center enthusiasts all over the planet. I'm Joshua Feinberg from DCSMI and host of the Data Center Go-to-Market podcast. And I'm being joined today by a very special guest. I'm welcoming Jon Summers, who is research leader from RISE, the Research Institutes of Sweden in Sweden. Jon, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks a lot, Joshua. Yeah, great to be here today. Yeah.
I really appreciate you making the time to join me today as well. And I'm super curious to learn about how you ended up in this place leading research around sustainability and energy use in the data center industry. Was this something that you had planned on early on in your career? Did you always know you'd end up working on the energy side of digital infrastructure, or did it just happen along the way?
No, I think it happened along the way. I mean, it's a story that goes back a long way. So I'm originally an academic. So I worked 25 years in a university in the UK. It was in mechanical engineering, but I got there from the fact that I was using computers to solve difficult problems. And so I was always messing around with computers, programming them to solve scientific engineering problems. And then and being in engineering and teaching thermodynamics and fluid mechanics, two topics that are very key to trying to understand how you manage heat in thermal and manage the thermal aspects of microelectronic systems, that got me interested into this as a research area. And of course, back in 2008, 2009, I thought it's really interesting how we could use liquids instead of air. And of course, I'd run my own high-performance computing system. I'd been part of the high-performance computing user group and the procurement of HPC for a lot of my scientific colleagues who use these supercomputers to solve problems. And so then I suddenly saw that the supercomputer was actually a problem in itself, in the fact that it draws so much energy, it needs these very clever ways of managing the thermal aspects and also, the power distribution. And then I grew a little research group out of that with some colleagues, and we had a lot of PhD students working in this area in all aspects. And then 2017, this opportunity came up. I've been 25 years in a university, and the opportunity came up to join RISE in Sweden. And I thought the UK was going through some turmoil with Brexit. I thought 25 years in one place was too long. Maybe it's time to jump out of the UK and jump into Europe. Although the UK has always been part of Europe, but there's Europe and there's Europe. And so that's really, I ended up joining this Research Institute of Sweden, which is actually a very large organization, and it has 38 locations in Sweden and 3,600 staff now. And it works on a lot of different applied areas, and one of them digital systems, which I sit in. And we sit in a unit which is next door to the largest OCP data center in Europe, or at the time when it was built in 2012, the Facebook data center in Luleå. And so it's kind of a neat place to go. It had lots of challenges temperature-wise in it, and you're very close to the Arctic Circle, but you saw lots of interesting things like the Aurora Borealis quite a lot, or you actually drive on the water in winter because it's totally frozen. It's so thick, the ice, that you can actually drive, heavy duty traffic on the ice. So all interesting things. And so now we've been working on trying to understand how we can improve the operations of data centers, how we can bring some data to sustainability, because it's easy to say I'm sustainable, but how do you prove that you're sustainable? Using data, and that's one of our calls to action really in what we're doing now. So that's kind of the story that got me there. Yeah.
I think what's super interesting too is to look at the timelines and kind of the genesis of how this all started. So back in 2008, you mentioned you were just starting to learn more and be curious more about liquid cooling. I think it was around 2016 that I was at a small mission critical conference in Phoenix, and I heard someone talking about liquid cooling. And a lot of people too don't realize Facebook's origins getting involved in sustainability and open compute going back to the early 2010s as well.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's super neat times. And I guess it worked out with you looking for the next chapter in your career, and an interesting, exciting geographic move to live in a completely different environment than where you were in the UK.
Yeah, so from wet to cold, if you like, although it can be warm in there. Yeah, I mean, the UK is traditionally wet, but yeah.
So in the course of what you do on a daily basis with your research, I'm sure you get to meet a lot of different data center professionals, a lot of different personalities, and you've probably gotten a feel for over time what makes people successful in their careers in this particular aspect of digital infrastructure. If you were to be approached by, or when you're approached by someone that's brand new to this space, maybe that's either still in high school or in university, and they've heard about these really exciting careers in data centers and digital infrastructure, because recently in the last few years, they're actually talked about in mainstream business media and financial media way more often than they were 7 or 8 years ago. They're curious about these careers, but they don't necessarily see themselves going into software development or engineering. They're leaning more on the client-facing side. They're curious about careers like marketing and sales and product management and account management. Maybe this is a friend of maybe a teenager of a neighbor or a cousin or family member or coworker, and they just would like you to give some insight advice to someone in that situation. What insight would you offer to them to help them figure out some career options in the space?
That's a good question, Joshua. I mean, I think it's one of the things from the getting youngsters involved in this is always has always been tricky because data centers are not like, they're not sexy is the word I think that is sometimes used. They don't look like a Formula One car or the incredulity of an aircraft. You can fly that through the air, 500 tons through the air, and it stays up. It defies gravity. But I think everybody is aware of the internet, but perhaps then they use digital services on a daily basis. But it's always trying to get people to think about, well, that's a physical system. And I think one of people may read little bits about data centers. They use a lot of energy. They are large. They look like large factories. Maybe they've seen pictures now. Of course, since Greenpeace put out that paper, How Dirty Is Your Data, and it kind of shamed the data center industry a little bit back in 2011. It prompted a lot of photographs to end up on the internet about, what does it look like inside a data center? But I think one of the best things I can say is, if you're approaching this industry, don't get pulled into the silos. That's the problem we have. It's a very siloed industry. And the reason why I say, look at it as an integrated system. It is a beautifully engineered system from very small components all the way out to the large building. So a good tip is to see every part as being important as the next. Think of it as a holistic system. And that helps see past all of these things, how things are done in specific ways, why they're done like that, and how they're done. So, that's kind of the advice I would give. But I think it's an intersection of many disciplines in the data centers, because you've obviously got the construction, you've got the electrical engineering part, you've got the mechanical engineering part, you've got IT, you've got software development, you've got there's a lot of components to this, and now with talking about sustainability, data centers want people who are well founded in understanding the principles of understanding, how one is sustainable and how do you measure that, and how do you get that into the marketing angle, because there's a lot of marketing that needs to be done as well. And I think now relationships with communities is going to be an important part of that, because data centers are coming in, consuming energy, and when it starts to get above 10% of a country's electrical generation, case in point, Ireland is one, Netherlands, it's almost 10%, Luxembourg, it's over 10%, Singapore is almost hitting 10%. And when these countries, they start to see that data centers, well, what are these guys doing? So it's there's a huge education piece as well. So I think don't just treat it as just an engineering system. Treat it as it's part of life now, and it's part of the era we're in, the digital era that we're in, and it's an important part of that. So, I try to sell it in one sense to youngsters, to say that this is a really interesting area to get in, but then when you sort of look between the cracks, or you read between the lines, once the data center is operational, it doesn't really employ a lot of people once it's operational. But then, the other side of that is that it's actually facilitating a lot of activity, a lot of economic activity, a lot of social activity. And that needs a lot of people to work behind that. So, you've got to treat it as a very integrated system, and that every part is as important as the next.
Yeah, I think you raise a couple of really interesting points. The idea that data centers are consuming such a significant percentage of a country's utility grid power is a phenomenon that's only seemed to pop up in the last 3, 4, 5 years, but it does seem to be accelerating because of AI and high performance computing. So increasingly, when I talk to operators, especially in a marketing role, I'm hearing that they're carving out part of their marketing budget for stakeholder relations with regulators and utility companies as important votes and relationships to build in the community. It's way beyond just sponsoring community events and signage and sports teams and things like that. But you also raised a really interesting point as well, with getting people that are new to the space, especially students contemplating these careers, to appreciate just how multifaceted the industry is. Like, we've counted 52 different business models across the operators, the technology, the facilities, the construction, and the real estate. And there's probably an interesting analogy to talk to students about, how your university has core requirements that everyone takes their first year to make them well-rounded. It almost seems like that's what a lot of employers should be doing with new employees. Thinking it was Schneider Electric I saw recently, maybe 6 months ago, that has a rotation program where they really, there's over the course of 10 or 12 months or something, every 6 or 8 weeks, they're rotating you into a different region, into a different role, in much the same way in the United States. UPS, the package delivery company, is famous for everyone starts by driving the truck for the first month or two on the job. It doesn't matter whether you're an accountant, an attorney, a software developer, ultimately going to be in logistics. Everyone starts with. So yeah, there's something to be said for people gaining this appreciation. I often use the analogy of like a hop-on, hop-off tour operator, or like a tram park driver at an amusement park, taking people around and showing them all the different facets of it before they get too deep in it. But I think you also raised a really interesting point too, of the competition that data center related companies have for young talent, because it hasn't historically been perceived as a sexy industry. And case in point, you're like literally right next door to Facebook. And when you talk to what would be a more appealing IT related job to someone 5 or 10 years ago, they probably would have said, I want to go work for Facebook or Apple or Amazon or Google or something like that. So yeah, it's super interesting to see how that comes full circle. And then of course, now there's this generational divide where Facebook isn't as cool as Instagram. So you're contending with that as well. But yeah, it's super interesting to see how that all plays out.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah.
So what about someone that's more mid-career? Maybe it's someone that you worked with 10 years ago, either at a university back in UK or someone that you might have met through a community or conference or something over the years, and you bump into them again, and they're kind of going through some soul searching, figuring out what the next chapter should be in their career. Maybe they're a little bit burnt out, but they do want to still stay in something related to digital infrastructure and a client-facing kind of role. What advice would you offer to a colleague like that who is looking to get their career back on track and stay working with something new and exciting in a growth area in the data center marketplace, data center ecosystem?
I mean, that sort of links to something that you just said just earlier on, in the sense that, I think maybe just shadowing somebody who's working in particular aspects of the data center. So, when I think of the silos again, and I'm thinking of somebody who maybe works closely with the software development or IT side of things, I think, I was thinking of this more I think when you shadow somebody, you walk around with them, and you can actually understand what their role is and what they're involved in. And of course, obviously, if it's done, in an appropriate way, that it doesn't contravene any confidentiality or anything, then I think people can learn a lot from that kind of thing and get an assessment of what's involved. And I don't actually work in a data center, and I don't. I'll explain a little bit later on. But a lot of I'm sort of interfacing with data centers with some of their pain points. I'm interfacing with some of the suppliers to the data center. So I see different different aspects of the business. And so when you bring students in and you get them close to that, then they realize, so this is obviously an early stage, then they realize actually this is quite important. But they don't have to be students, they can be students of the third age or something, coming in and just, what do they call it? Monitoring. We used to have, people used to monitor my courses to see whether it's a course that they would take, in the first couple of lectures, so those kind of things I think could help somebody pivot or change their career path, or change their I don't know how to deal with burnt out. I don't know, because I think this industry, it's easy to get burnt out. I can see that in a number of situations. But closing the divide on different aspects of the data center, that can spark opportunities, I think, as well.
Yeah, that raises a really interesting topic, because internships are a fairly popular concept with people early on in their career, but you don't hear them happening very often with people later on in their career. One, because in some cases they're free internships, or the compensation is relatively minimal, and people usually on their career don't have the luxury of being able to take a couple of months off to survey what's next. So you kind of look at the communities and the conferences and people going on tours of data centers to perhaps expose them to these different ideas. There was a popular movie maybe back about 10 years ago with Robert De Niro and Anne Hathaway, where he was a 70-year-old intern working in a e-commerce clothing company. It's actually a pretty cute movie, funny movie, but yeah, you don't hear of that happening very often. So I think actually that's a really interesting area for the industry to address as well, because I, over the years, have seen a lot of talented people in sales and marketing roles that have went on that have left the data center related companies and gone into SaaS because there were better opportunities there, more growth. I guess a lot of it has to do with where the capital is flowing, where the biggest growth, who's hiring the most. But yeah, for sure, a lot of recruitment challenges could potentially be addressed by more creativity around human resources with retaining and retraining, and taking some people that are showing some interest maybe of getting involved in cybersecurity or cooling or power or some other facilities aspect or construction aspect. And the challenge is figuring out what the transition looks like. But it's a super interesting approach to look at helping people to sample from the career smorgasbord of available options,
yes, exactly,
to help them kind of reset and see if they're really in the best place. Because it does seem like something for sure that would get very, very neglected in the hustle and bustle of daily routines and goals and KPIs and big projects and initiatives.
Well, I think you've come up with something interesting there. I mean, maybe we should push, the industry needs to push for internships of the third age. Yeah.
Yeah, and there's companies in the tech ecosystem, especially SaaS companies, that have become famous for having sabbaticals when you're with a company for 5 or 10 years. Maybe part of the concept is when you've been in the same job role for 5 or 10 years and you want to explore another career path within the same company,
you get a sabbatical. Yeah, I mean,
maybe there's a rotation.
Yeah, I mean, academia definitely does that. I mean, that's always, because you get stuck into, teaching and the churn and everything. But then said, okay, that's it. You've done 5 years now. You take 1 year off. You go somewhere, and you reset a little bit. So it's and you come back to the job again, get on the treadmill again. So, yeah. But maybe it gives you some things to reflect on, or maybe you discover new areas of research that you want to, because researchers you need to keep reading what's going on in the field. You can't just sit there and hope to absorb things. As they fly by the screen, you've actually got to go out and do research. See what's happening, and that takes time. Scholarship, they call it. Yeah.
There for sure are, in certain companies at a certain size, you do see people with like a chief innovation officer type of title whose role it is to go beyond just routine product management. But yeah, for sure, there's a need to ignite these bigger conversations. Otherwise, an organization like OCP would never have existed in the first place if they didn't explore like, hey, the proprietary specifications are holding us back. What do we get to get everyone speaking the same language, developing uncommon platforms to make things more interchangeable, and to actually establish standards as a way to preemptively head off the need for government regulators to get involved.
Indeed, yeah.
Facebook certainly has a lot of the large tech companies have a lot of experience in trying to stay ahead of the curve to keep from regulatory interference down the road.
The Data Center Go-to-Market podcast is sponsored by DCSMI, elevating the role of sales, marketing, and go-to-market GTM professionals in the growth of the data center industry. To stay informed about upcoming episodes, make sure that you subscribe to the Data Center Sales and Marketing newsletter on the DCSMI website that can be found at www.dcsmi.com. Again, that URL is www.dcsmi.com.
Jon, I'm really curious from your perspective, when you look at what's going on in the data center industry in the Nordics, across Europe, globally, what do you think is the biggest avoidable mistake that people should be paying attention to now more than ever?
Yeah, I think I was going to say, actually, the biggest mistake I've seen probably in data centers is possibly the IT guy not putting back the blanking panel. Yeah. You could call that a mistake, perhaps that's an education piece as well. Yeah, always put the blanking panels back. In fact, that's probably the simplest and most important part of the white space. Don't underestimate the blanking panel, as they say. Which is this piece of plastic or a metal sheet, whatever that blanks the rack where you don't want the cold air to mix with the hot air when in an air-cooled data center. But I think what's also happening now is from the sustainability perspective is there's a little bit of carbon myopia. Everybody's focused on carbon and from a sustainability, and I think that could be a mistake because it kind of because sustainability has a lot more than just global warming. But I think everybody, in the Nordics, obviously, for example, say we've got low carbon intensity electricity. So, the operations of data centers in the Nordics looks really good because, it runs on electricity. So it's going to, in its operational phase, it's going to look pretty good from a carbon perspective. But, and then we're trying to understand the embodied carbon, the carbon that ends up in manufacturing components. But But putting data centers together and all of the critical raw materials that go into that are also very important. And I think, we talk about this green transition. I think we seriously need to look at how this is going to stack up, particularly in Europe, for example. I mean, I guess Europe always seems to be at the forefront of trying to do things from a sustainable perspective, and I think, when you start crunching the numbers, how you're going to meet those green transition targets, you suddenly realize that, do we have the actual material resource to do this? And, data centers are part of that because they're the huge demand on material resources. So I think at a high level, from a sustainability perspective, that could be a mistake to focus entirely on carbon.
Yeah, that's a really great point. It's really interesting when I conduct these podcast interviews. I've noticed an enormous difference between the two sides of the pond. I actually can get through a podcast interview in the United States without sustainability coming up 5, 6, 7 times in the course of the conversation. It's nearly impossible for someone not to bring up how their company is helping to promote some aspect of sustainability. But you're right, for sure, everyone has a different definition of what it is. A lot of the hyperscalers have received a lot of criticism that what they're calling sustainable really isn't as sustainable as the general public and their investors are being led to believe. So there's, for sure, I do see a need to get a lot clearer on what sustainable, getting beyond just carbon emissions and how low that works. And you're right, the humble blanking panel, I laughed when you brought that up, because I remember seeing about 6 months ago, someone in a sales role from one of the big operators, I don't remember, it was probably either like NTT or Equinix or Digital Realty, one of the big ones, talking about how you walk into their halls and there's always a bin of spare blanking panels that are available for anyone that's going to work on a server, so they can put those back in place to help with the efficiency. And the marketer and the branding person in me said, at the absolute minimum, they may be talking about how they're big heroes, that they're making this expense, but it's actually an opportunity where they could probably even get someone to sponsor that would love to have Vertiv, Schneider, someone like that, NVIDIA, that would love to have their logos just promoting the idea of sustainability and putting more of these, filling up the spaces in the racks with these blanking panels.
Yeah, and the performance of the blanking panel. The Vertiv blanking panel is far better than somebody else's blanking panel. So, although let's not go there, but it's but it could be a good marketing angle. Yeah, but it's and the blanking panels, they do look a bit boring, don't they? They're just one color. You could have some logos on them. Yeah, could make it a little bit more interesting.
The intentions are in the right place.
Well, the human mind works
being equal, blanking panels are good, whereas no blanking panels, I guess, are that any blanking panel coverage is probably better than no blanking panels.
Yeah. I mean, it's just something that came to mind at the time, because the humble blanking panel. Yeah. But there you go. Yeah.
Super easy to implement, super inexpensive to implement. No excuse for not dotting the I's and crossing the T's with that. Jon, when you think about, you have the privilege and the ability to look at a lot of different facets of these industries, from some very large companies to some mid-sized companies across a lot of different industries. Where do you think the idea of research and standards development is going over the next 2, 3, 4 years when you look out into your crystal ball? What do you think is going to change?
Yeah, I mean, we're in this very interesting phase of digitalization, is where, now we mentioned liquid cooling a while back, and you said you'd come across liquid cooling in 2016. I was messing around with it a little bit earlier in the lab. And of course, high performance computing systems, the supercomputers, the top 500, they've been using liquid cooling for some time. But now with AI, it's become mainstream. So it's interesting how this has sort of driven driven something that's still on the surface has not really made a great major advances. But now we're getting to the point where actually it physically is impossible to cool some of the next generation of equipment with air. Or let me rephrase that. It's physically impossible to cool those next generation electronics with small volumes of infrastructure. I mean, you can have huge volumes and still cool it, but that's the key here. So we're on this, on this AI wave, and I think AI brings with it not just the demand for power and the demand for cooling and the demand for additional infrastructure, and everybody is clambering over everybody else to get a piece of the action. It also brings with it some interesting aspects, social aspects, societal aspects, and I think, and I was very interested in reading a paper recently, and I put a post out on LinkedIn on this, and it was in 1964, which is actually 60 years ago. It was in September 1964, so it was actually 60 years ago. The paper by Nikolai Kardashev, who was a Russian astronomer. He wrote it in Russian in April, and it was translated into English in September. And basically, he was asking the question, well, how much power do we need to transmit in all directions some information that will eventually land on an extraterrestrial civilization's radio telescope or something? And he did this calculation in this paper, and it's a significant amount of power. And it's around about 500 to 1,000 times more power than we globally consume as a human race today to do that. And so he called, when a civilization was able to do that, he called it a Type 1 civilization. And then Carl Sagan came along. Carl Sagan, the famous, he did these sort of outreach programs to try and bring cosmology into people's living rooms with the Cosmos program back in the 70s and the 80s. And he thought, well, yeah, okay, Kardashev talked about a Type 1 and a Type 2 and a Type 3 civilization. It turns out that Type 1, you need to use all the energy on the planet. Type 2, you need to use all the energy that your star is able to produce. And Type 3 is something else. It's intergalactic, interplanetary, or intersolar system. And Carl Sagan said, well, really, we need a more granular, we need a more continuous type classification. And so the Kardashev scale, which was 1, 2, and 3, became continuous. So now we're at 0.73. So we're a type 0.73 civilization. And it's interesting that type 0.7, we reached 0.7 on this Kardashev scale in 1972, which was really when the first CMOS microprocessor was produced by Intel. And so that, if you think, he thought of that as the beginning of the digital age, 0.7. Well, we're at 0.73 now, but to get to 0.8, which is the end of the digital age and the beginning of the emergent age, as they're calling it now, so that we're consuming a lot more power. But we have this problem, is that we're constrained by being able to generate power without overheating the planet, without destroying the environment, without doing X, Y, and Z that is going to put us in a very serious position with the climate. AI starts to kick in, and AI may be able to help us get to 0.8 on the Kardashev scale. I think this is by 2100 we're going to be looking at this. And this is an interesting, it brings astronomy into AI, and it brings it all together, and power consumption. And when you see, sometimes AI gives us a perspective on things that we didn't really realize, because it's not that it's intelligent, it's just that it can bring a lot of information that we have now in digital format together and process it really fast to try and find optimal ways of progressing. And so, I think to get to 0.8, the Kardashev 0.8, we definitely need nuclear fusion. But the problem we have is when we generate electricity on the surface of the planet, we start to overheat the planet more from the heat generated from the electrical production. So we have to be really careful of that. So I think it requires us to do energy production in space, probably, so that we don't overheat the planet. So now I'm on a flight of fancy here. With you said 2 years, and I'm looking at 75 years from now. So sorry about that.
I'm thinking that at some point, someone is going to forward a link to what you just mentioned to Elon Musk, and there's going to be some startup that he's going to work on for
I want a piece of the action.
Extraterrestrial terrestrial power generation to deal with not overheating the planet and getting to 0.8. But yes, it's super interesting to look at how this research on how to communicate outside of Earth actually even preceded, you're right, it was the CMOS PC, like early 70s. People think of Palo Alto, the park, the research, the original Ethernet mouse, the graphical user interface, Bob Metcalf, all the stuff that originally led to ARPANET and eventually the commercial internet. So yeah, even during the Cold War era, when months to translate something from Russian into English. So you see AI having the application of being able to eventually accelerate answers on how to address these issues?
Yeah, I think it's going to be an enabling tool in that sense, because it will allow us to, I mean, I don't want to get too optimistic about these things, because I think with the AI hype at the moment, it's kind of, we're going to hit cloud 9 or we're going to crash. We're riding the crest of a wave at the moment, and it's difficult to know whether this could just be a fad or something but it's definitely, I think it's the research community is taking AI very seriously. From being able to use it to suggest looking at things in a different way, because the human brain, although it's really fast or it's heuristics, we can do heuristics. What computers can do that we can't do so fast is to take huge volumes of information and juxtapose this in different ways, to try and see what the possible answers are. I mean, now it's fascinating that you can, it used to took ages to write a program in a particular language. You can just ask an AI tool to write me a program in any language. It seems to know all programming languages, and it will do that. And if you don't like what is produced, you can ask it to refine it. But I think when we use these large language models, we've got to be careful, because there is a thing called artificial hallucination as well. So it does, as well as the intelligence part, there's also the hallucination part. So it needs to be fact checked, I think. But it's going to be an interesting journey then to 0.8 on the Kardashev scale. And I think AI will, if it's truly the digital age that we're in, between 0.7 and 0.8, and that's a factor of 10 in power. So we've got to, in 72, we were using so much power as a human species. By the time we get to 0.8 in 2100, we're going to be consuming 10 times that. So in the period of, I don't know, 128 years. I mean, these are rough. I mean, when you're looking in the future, it's always a guesstimate, isn't it?
And even from a practical standpoint, it's come up more than once where people have debated, okay, the data centers need all of this power. What happens if EV adoption grows from 10% of your neighbors driving electric cars to 50% or 80% of your neighbors driving electric cars? Can the grid handle it, or is the grid going to collapse? And I think at least in a lot of areas in the US, there's no way the grid is ready for EVs having anywhere near that kind of market share.
And not in Europe either. I don't think anywhere. I don't know whether in China they might be able to do it. I don't know, but they're still using a lot of coal. And I think the other interesting thing is that we have reached peak oil. We're going to be reaching peak coal by 2052, maybe. Some research has shown. So it's going to become, we're going to have to look for alternative energy sources other than fossil fuels. Definitely, yeah.
From a productivity standpoint, with what you do on a daily, weekly, monthly basis, have you seen much impact yet with AI on your work that you do at Rise?
I mean, only that AI, that everything, the data center itself, now being an AI data center, has really changed what we do. It's now brought liquid cooling into the mainstream a little bit. So we're at the early stages of that, and I think it's clear that the next generation of systems will eventually have to adopt liquid cooling, and I think everybody's gearing themselves up now for liquid cooling. It's kind of an acceptance because AI is there. We're now accepting that liquid cooling is a necessity, whereas it was very niche before. It was only the crazy HPC guys that did these things, that wanted all this compute close together to solve interesting problems like, galaxies colliding or actually predicting the weather tomorrow. We use supercomputers to do a lot of this, so, but now, AI is on everybody's handset almost. You just pick up this piece of electronics, which is just the size of your hand, and it's phenomenal now. That's the end of that. The other end of that is going to be something that just needs liquid cooling, that the crazy HPC guys were doing 10 years ago. Started 10 years ago, yeah. So that's changed a lot, and of course, and I think that the tremendous amount of now wanting to understand how to, realizing that now if we do this, we are going to upset a lot of people because we're going to be drawing on a lot of power from the electrical grids. So how do we now change the narrative? Data centers don't use energy, they borrow energy. We're just borrowing it. We're going to pass it on, which is we're going to transform it and pass it on. But that's kind of now the interesting aspect of what's happening in Europe, because the demand, don't waste that heat that comes out of these data centers. Let's make something of it. And of course that now challenges, and that's coming from AI to start with. But how do you actually reliably or use the heat that makes sense, that you're not putting in so much material resource to get a very small gain, and this is where, from a sustainability point of view, we need to actually look at the whole thing, the big picture. If you use more infrastructure to do heat recovery, don't be surprised that some of the sustainability metrics that measure the material resource that you need to run these systems actually has a negative impact. So it's a balance, and that needs a lot of research and data to do that.
Yeah, I mean, for sure, on the surface, to the layperson, to a non-technical person, hearing the idea that hyperscale, not so good, but decentralized data center is really good, put them next to a residential apartment building or an office building, and heat reuse is awesome. Or I've talked to people with the heat reuse in the swimming pools. There's a lot of really interesting applications with that. But yeah, the question is, as it starts to roll out and scale, are there unforeseen externalities that need to be addressed as well?
That's right. Otherwise, it becomes a little bit of a lab experiment, and it's a little bit too much of a greenwashing experiment. So yeah, we're reusing the heat, but I mean, I think we've got to look at these things very, very pragmatically and realistically, and we've got to look at the whole picture. And that's my opinion. But also, I think I don't want to just state the opinion. I want to show the facts. I want to show the data, which is substantiated by solid, sound research. And that's, let the data do the talking. There's too much opinion in this industry and not enough data. It's the data center industry. Where's the data? Yeah.
And that's where Rise plays a really important role, because even among the largest operators, there's so much pressure constantly to meet aggressive growth targets with the capital that funds all of this growth, that it's they'll do some innovation, they'll do some research, but nowhere near this broad-reaching scope of the kind of research and potential for innovation that you have the opportunity to influence throughout Europe and globally.
Yeah, I think we're very lucky in the position we're in at this moment. You know, we're having a lot of fun, put it that way, as well. Yeah.
That's terrific. Well, Jon, I really appreciate you sharing your expertise so generously. This has been a really fascinating look at careers and how people look at sustainability, the problems with focusing just too much on carbon, the challenges of AI, the idea of being able to pass communication to future generations and different galaxies, where this all started with being able to transmit. There's so many interconnected pieces that our audience is really going to get a ton of value from hearing from you. I really, really appreciate it. It's been very, very, very informative. If someone wants to learn more about what you're working on or follow you or connect with you, is LinkedIn a good place to reach out to you?
Yes, I mean, I don't use any other social media, only LinkedIn. I mean, I guess it's a little bit more of the high class social media, but it's, you can find me on LinkedIn, Jon Summers. And I'm always happy to connect with people. And I love difficult questions. So if anybody's got difficult questions to answer, I'll give that a go. And also, I love being challenged. So that's part of the old working as an academic and the academic banter that has been going on for many years. It's always been fun.
Yeah, it's terrific. It's definitely come into focus in recent years that with its billion plus users, that LinkedIn is the predominant social networking platform for technology professionals, and especially in and around digital infrastructure. If someone wants to learn more about the work that you do at RISE, especially the kind of work that's specific to digital infrastructure and data centers, where would you send them? A website, any particular social media?
Yeah, it's an easy one for what we do at ICE, because we're called the ICE Data Center, which is the unit, which is part of RISE. So it's ri.se/ICE, and then that will get you to what we do. Yeah, we'll get you to our newsletter. It will get you to, so you can track what we're up to. It will get you to our projects that we've got going, and it may even interest you to become a partner. We have a partnership program which may be valuable to some entities out there. But communicate with us. We're happy to talk.
That's terrific. And I'll include the links to that in the notes and the blog post that goes along with this podcast as well, for viewers and readers and listeners that are curious to learn more. But this has all been super fascinating, very informative, kind of a crash course on the state of sustainability research and energy research, on where digital infrastructure is headed, and thinking through issues that often are overlooked in a commercial context. So thanks so much. I've been speaking with Jon Summers, who is the research leader of the RISE Research Institutes of Sweden. Thanks again, Jon. Really appreciate it.
Thanks a lot, Joshua. Yeah, great fun. We had a good time. Yeah.
Awesome.
The Data Center Go-to-Market podcast is sponsored by DCSMI, elevating the role of sales, marketing, and go-to-market GTM professionals in the growth of the data center industry. To stay informed about upcoming episodes, make sure that you subscribe to the Data Center Sales and Marketing newsletter on the DCSMI website that can be found at www.dcsmi.com. Again, that URL is www.dcsmi.com.